Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Very Cold Lasagna Podcast. I am your host, Dylan Lasagna. This is episode number 256 of this icy yet spicy podcast for your filthy casual takes on the world of sports, for you filthy casual fans out there like you and me. In this episode, we're here for our 2024 NFL season team recap month once again with the third part, covering some more teams in our season team recaps. So in the last two episodes, we covered 12 teams around the National Football League in the last year. In part one, we talked about the bottom dwellers, the disastrous six, and those teams were the Tennessee Titans, the Cleveland Browns, the New York Giants, the New England Patriots, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Las Vegas Raiders. And the last episode, which was part two, we talked about the New York Jets, the Carolina Panthers, the New Orleans Saints, the Chicago Bears, the Dallas Cowboys, and the Miami Dolphins. So we're 12 teams down, and we have about, I'd say, 19 more to go. So we still got a long ways to go to wrap up our 2024 NFL season team recap month. But hey, stick around. And in case you missed those last two episodes, those last two parts of our season team recap month, make sure after this episode, go listen to my coverage, my recaps on those 12 teams in case you missed them. So in this third part, we're going to be covering some more teams that were pretty disappointing. I know I said that in the last episode, but these are teams that were disappointing in the sense that why did they waste our time? Why did they waste our time with watching them this season? And I'll expand on that. I'll expand on that in just a bit. So before we get into all that, we do have a lot to cover before we get into our actual team recaps, and because we're on the dawn of free agency. We're on the dawn of free agency, the dawn of a new league year. So we're going to be covering some news when it comes to what's going on just before the start of free agency. Even though by the time this gets out, it's already started. But there was some pre-free agency news, some pre-new league year news that came out already. So we're gonna talk about all that news in this episode, and some updates that also happened since the last episode came out, like it did in a couple episodes ago. And a little housekeeping before we get started as well. Make sure you follow Very Cold Lasagna on social media at Very Cold Lasagna, wherever networks I'm on. And for all my audio listeners out there, make sure to continue to listen to the Very Cold Lasagna Podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. And for people watching on YouTube, make sure to continue to do so. Continue to smash the like button. And if you're not subscribed already, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and leave your comments down below. Leave your takes on the topic at hand, this being our third part of our 2024 NFL season team recap month. And the teams that we're going to be talking about here in this episode, you'll find out in just a bit. And as always, share this with your friends, share this with your neighbor, share this with your colleagues, whether it's at work or school. Share the good, the bad, the ugly about this filthy casual sports podcast called Very Cold Lasagna. So that being said, let's get into some updates, some free agency news that happened since the last time we were here on this podcast. So compared to the last episode where we were in this segment, when it came to updates from part one of our team recaps, part two, there were a lot of updates since the last time we were here doing team recaps. So clearly, we're at the dawn of free agency, as if it hadn't started already. But there have been a lot of moving parts from not just teams that I've already talked about, also from teams that I have yet to talk about. So that being said, let's get into the moves. Let's speed run through these moves, and I'll give you my thoughts and opinions on all these moves. So for the Chicago Bears, they made some trades for their offensive line. They traded for Rams guard Jonah Jackson, and they also traded for the Chiefs' top guard in Joe Thuney. And surprisingly, all these were for relatively low day 3 picks. So for Jonah Jackson from the Rams, it was for next year's 6th round pick. And then for Joe Thuney, it was only for a 4th round pick, also for next year's draft. So the Bears, for Ryan Poles, this was one of their top needs. Actually, the top need this past offseason. And some credit to him, he actually went out and addressed the offensive line. Got him some protection for Caleb Williams. Tooney, the top lineman for the Chiefs, they sent him packing. Clearly couldn't afford him anymore. And well, the Bears had the money. They had something to give to Kansas City, but surprisingly, a 4th round pick for the top lineman for Kansas City. Wow, I'm surprised they got they fleeced him. But I mean, we'll see how he does in Chicago. But the more important thing was getting that protection for Caleb Williams. Some other moves that also happened. The Jets, they released Davante Adams in an expected move. They were trying to trade him, but I don't think anyone was going to take on that big fat contract. So they went out and traded him. Now, who was going to want to take him? Well, that remains to be seen. But Davante Adams, reportedly, he wants to play on a West Coast team. Well, there might be a certain team down south here in the Bay that might want to take him, but we'll see. Meanwhile, the Jaguars made a bunch of moves recently prior to free agency. They initially released Christian Kirk, but it was later revealed that they ended up trading him within the division to the Houston Texans in return for next year's 7th round pick. So the Texans kind of made a little smart play, trade for Christian Kirk, because they're not going to have Tank Dell next year, like all season. So, and they're going to clearly need help when it comes to the receiving game. And I don't think they're going to get Stephon Diggs back because he's a free agent as well. So they're going to need something to produce when it comes to getting some help for Nico Collins too. And then other moves that the Jaguars made, they released a bunch of players. Special teamer Devin Duvernay, Josh Reynolds at receiver, and surprisingly, Evan Ingram at tight end. Like, why would they release Evan Ingram? He was one of their top producers on the offense for the last 2 years. So I'm not sure why that was. Maybe it was a cost-cutting move, but I'm a little curious why exactly they released Evan Ingram. They also lost center Mitch Morse because he announced his retirement. He played for 10 seasons in the NFL. So congrats on his retirement. Meanwhile, for the Las Vegas Raiders, them and Max Crosby, their top edge rusher, they agreed to a new big fat contract, a 3-year, $106 million extension. So Max Crosby gets a big payday to stay in Las Vegas as they prepare for WrestleMania relatively soon. And, well, they probably, within that contract, they probably gave him some tickets for WrestleMania. Just kidding, I don't know. Meanwhile, they also made some other moves to try and bolster up the offensive line, but I'm not sure if this was a nice one because they signed guard Alex Kappa, who was one of the worst offensive linemen last year for Cincinnati. They also released Gardner Minshew, so clearly they're going in a much different direction at quarterback. Meanwhile, for my San Francisco 49ers, they also made a bunch of moves. Well, at least soon to be moves, but one of the moves they officially made was trading away receiver Deebo Samuel. And yeah, it was talked about, it was rumored about since the season ended, but it became official that Deebo Samuel is no longer a 49er. He is going across the country to the nation's capital, to the Washington Commanders in return for a 5th round pick. Now, there have been ramblings that they're trying to get a 4th round pick, and they were going to try to do a player swap for defensive tackle Jonathan Allen, but I guess they didn't want to take on that big fat contract. But hell, you might get a little 2 for 1, given that if Washington doesn't find a trade partner and they end up releasing him, you never know if you might get him. But anyway, Deebo Samuel, he gets traded to Washington, and I will admit, he was a very key part of the offense ever since the Niners drafted him in 2019. Unfortunately, he's really regressed in the last 2 years, especially this past year, in with all the injuries, and I'd say his ego was starting to uptick a lot, and especially getting fights with the special teams unit, and his performance dipping a lot. So maybe a change in scenery will really help both sides of the ball for the 49ers and for Debo. So we'll see how he does. I wish him the best of luck. Washington, hopefully he'll be a very key weapon for Jay and Daniels. Meanwhile, for the reigning and defending undisputed Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles, they made some moves to start their free agency period. They first cut veteran corners James Bradbury and Darius Slay. It's a cost-cutting move, but they already have their young stud corners, and they decided to also reward a couple players with some new contracts. Saquon Barkley, for example, was one of them. He agreed to a 2-year, $41 million extension, making him the highest-paid running back in the NFL. They also gave linebacker Zach Bond a big fat contract extension. I think it was like 3 years, $51 million. So he's another highly paid linebacker as well. But nonetheless, the Eagles are paying their players well, and Howie Roseman continues to make sure that the core stays intact for as long as possible. So that's all I have for you when it comes to updates around the NFL, especially as we get closer to free agency. And who knows, maybe I might do a little free agency special, but we'll see. We'll see, because there's going to be so many moving parts for almost every team in the NFL. And trying to do it in a team recap may not be enough, but stay tuned. Stay tuned. You never know. So that's all I got for you when it comes to updates from the last episode with the team recaps, especially for the teams that I talked about already, and for the teams that I've yet to talk about in the coming future. So now let's move on to the actual topic at hand, and let's talk about our 2024 NFL season team recap month, part number 3. And in this part, we've already talked about the 12 teams that were either very bad, like so terrible that like you couldn't bear to watch them, or the teams that, like in the last episode, that had the expectation of at least trying to make a playoff spot, for the most part at least, but they disappointed in one way or another, or there were circumstances that were so out of their control that, well, they didn't make it to the dance. In this part, in part 3, we're going to be talking about a select number of teams where they also had those expectations, and they either had those expectations or they didn't have those expectations, but they were getting close. They were getting close to the dance, but they ended up wasting our time. As I alluded to the very beginning of this episode, they just ended up wasting our time. It's like it was a waste of a season for pretty much almost all the teams that we're going to be talking about here in this episode. So these are the teams that just almost made it to the playoff dance, but they just ended up wasting our time for the most part. So that being said, let's get into part 3 of our 2024 NFL season team recap month, and the teams that almost made it to the playoff dance, but again, they ended up wasting our time. Beginning part 3 of our 2024 NFL season team recap month was a team that had a lot of questions, and most recently hosted a Royal Rumble that ended with a shocker. It ended with the yeet, and that was the Indianapolis Colts. Indy was a dropped 4th down pass short of their first playoff appearance in 3 years in 2023. But the main concern going into 2024 was figuring out whether their 4th overall pick, Anthony Richardson, would be the guy to lead them long term. If you remember, Anthony Richardson only played 4 games in 2023, and then he was lost for the year with a serious shoulder injury, leaving Gardner Minshew to pretty much lead the team the rest of the way. And again, alluding to the fourth down pass that, had they converted that, they still had a chance to make the playoffs. But unfortunately, the Colts did not. So there's no more Gardner Minshew for the Colts this past season. And it is now the Anthony Richardson show fully, now that he is fully healthy. So looking back at the offseason last year for the Colts, they pretty much focused their resources that was available to them mostly on keeping their in-house free agents, such as re-signing corner Kenny Moore and safety Julian Blackmon, while handing out a bunch of extensions to the likes of receiver Michael Pittman Jr. and edge rusher DeForest Buckner. Outside of that, it was a pretty quiet offseason. Shane Steichen, the head coach, and the Colts fan base, again, they had to ask the question, was Anthony Richardson going to be the man in Indianapolis? So we pretty much we weren't really sure of an answer, because Anthony Richardson, it was pretty much an up and down season. And in my opinion, is kind of leaning towards down, in my personal opinion, at least, because there was a lot of season-long inconsistency with Richardson, because to start the year, he was pretty uneven as a passer, because that's what I wanted to see from Anthony Richardson. I wanted to see what he looked like as a passer, because as a runner, kind of like Lamar Jackson, he's pretty damn good. But as a passer, he was very shaky because he made a bunch of interceptions that could have been avoided, but unfortunately, he made a lot of avoidable picks. He did well as a running quarterback, sometimes being the top rusher over, the glue that kept everything together in Jonathan Taylor. However, his passing performances early on left a lot to be desired. And then he also missed 2 games with an oblique injury, which further held off his development. And when he came back, those concerns that had a lot of people talking, it grew even higher. It grew even louder when in a key Week 8 game in Houston, and the Colts were trying to fight back against the Texans in a kind of tight game. He pulled himself out for one play to quote unquote take a breather. I believe that's what he said at the time. And him pulling himself out of that game for one play, that he received a lot of flack for it, and rightfully so. I mean, you're the franchise quarterback, and you need to take a breather. Like, this is not the NBA. This is not the NHL, where you can just head to the bench if you need a breather. So he was already receiving criticism for his performances and the turnovers, but now people were questioning him about his work ethic. His head coach was starting to question him about his work ethic, and now his backup quarterback, Joe Flacco, is implying about his work ethic. So now Shane Steichen makes the decision to bench Anthony Richardson and put in Joe Flacco. And unfortunately, Joe Flacco, who had already played a couple games for in place of Anthony Richardson while he was out for the oblique injury, he starts for Minnesota, and he starts for the game against Buffalo. Did terribly in both of them. So Steichen puts Anthony Richardson back in the starting lineup, and he actually does pretty good against the New York Jets. Granted, the Jets suck, but still, the point is, Anthony Richardson had the best game against the Jets, where he made much better decisions and better throws, and he actually had the game-winning rushing touchdown. So I know it was only one game, but it seemed like at the time, Richardson had whatever he learned during the time when he got benched, it seemed like Richardson was on the right path. But however, that wasn't the case. Because outside of that and another comeback win over the New England Patriots a couple weeks later, it was pretty much more of the same prior to being benched. Before he got hurt again with another separate injury, and then he was lost for the last, I believe it was like 2 games of the year. So I will say Richardson played a lot more this year. He at least got a little bit more experience, but it wasn't much. He didn't look real good in most of the games he played. Now, some can point towards an often rotating offensive line that was so beat up by injuries that Anthony Richardson, that also affected his development. But he's still a dual threat quarterback. He kind of made up for it with his rushing ability, but he still made too many mistakes. He just didn't look very comfortable throwing it in general. Some of it also had to do with the play calling of Shane Steichen, deferring it to Jonathan Taylor in the rushing attack. And maybe he could have set up more plays for Richardson to succeed as a passer. So, in essence, not what you were really hoping for if you're a Colts fan when it came to Anthony Richardson in his first actual year as a starting quarterback. Another thing that was pretty bad for the Colts this year was that awful passing defense. Like, they were so bad defending the pass. Outside of corner Kenny Moore and safety Julian Blackmon, that defense had a very, very hard time stopping opposing receivers. And what did he get as a result? Allowing a bunch of points. And what made this issue even worse is that they're often out there so much. Like, they were out there most of the time because Anthony Richardson, the offense, they couldn't pull their weight. Like, Richardson, yeah, he was, again, was often going 3 and out, was turning the ball over. That the defense was out there as fast as Richardson was gone off the field already. But it wasn't all doom and gloom for the Indianapolis Colts because it was like they had a bad season because they're still mostly in it until the end. And a lot of that had to do with Jonathan Taylor. Outside of a stretch in November where he really struggled, Taylor once again reaffirmed himself as one of the NFL's top running backs and being a pivotal piece of a stagnating offense. So Taylor had a really good productive season. Almost. Now, why do I say almost? Because, well, he was a very pivotal part of also killing the Colts season because in Denver, he made a boneheaded decision to get cocky, get arrogant, and on a big touchdown run that could have put the Colts up ahead against Denver, well, he decided to pull I think it was a Deshaun Jackson play where he dropped it like right before the goal line. Yeah, he did that. And then that was called a touchback. And that reverse touchdown, yeah, that allowed Denver to light a fire in themselves and completely blow the brakes off of Indianapolis in the Mile High. Now, afterwards, Jonathan Taylor made up for that, but it was already too late. It was already too late for the Colts. And then, on another positive note for Indy, they managed to get a solid receiving core, despite having a down year from Michael Pittman Jr. Now, you look at the other receiving options, and you look at Alec Pierce and Josh Downs. They took steps forward to help round out this solid receiving core, especially in the games where Joe Flacco played. Pierce and Downs were the primary receiving targets, and they made the most of their chances after the catch. Now, if Richardson can take that leap finally next season and gain chemistry with all three of them, especially during the time where they're training in the offseason, then the Colts may have something. So overall, when it came to the 2024 season for the Indianapolis Colts, it felt like a repeat of last year, except with more games played from Anthony Richardson, and they were in the playoff hunt of things. And now you have Joe Flacco playing the Gardner Minshew role, minus a bunch of other minus the amount of games played with Minshew, and minus the playoff stakes in the last week of the regular season. So they finished the season at 8-9. They missed the playoffs, obviously, and it's not exactly the best place you want to be if you're a Colts fan or the Colts themselves. Being stuck in the pit of mediocrity. That's not where the Colts want to be. Yeah, here they are, to the anger and disappointment of many people in their fan base, including Pat McAfee, a former player of the Colts, who went on a long Twitter post stating his disappointment and, well, selling or whatever he did with this usual suite in the last couple weeks of the regular season. Yet Jim Irsay was content on keeping Shane Steichen, which was kind of understandable. It was only his second season. But he also decided to keep general manager Chris Ballard, which wasn't understandable because he's whiffed so much on a bunch of offseason moves that, well, why haven't he fired him at this point? So if the Colts so-called big three, Irsay, Ballard, Steichen, they want to win the trust back of their fans that isn't giving them a WrestleMania, giving them a SummerSlam in the next several years, then they got to make some serious moves. So looking at the offseason so far for the Colts, they have around $35 million. That's not really much to spend, if we're being honest. It's a decent amount, but not much. They have the 14th overall pick. Some of their key free agents include safety Julian Blackmon, who only signed a one-year deal last offseason. Joe Flacco, their backup quarterback. And on the offensive line, you have guard Will Fries and center Ryan Kelly. So, again, not too many in-house free agents this time around. But, of course, it's very important on who you're going to keep. Now, looking at some of the needs they have to address this soon in the offseason, you got to get some help around linebacker Zaire Franklin. There was a reason why Zaire had the third most tackles in the NFL because, well, there was no one else to help him in the front seven. So Chris Ballard has to go get him some more quality depth around him to not only help him out, but also not whiff on their tackles because they missed a lot this past season. Meanwhile, staying within the defense, they have to go and upgrade the cornerback position because just like with Zaire, corner Kenny Moore was all by himself. He had no help on the opposite side of him. This is another spot where Ballard also needs to give more to running mates. They have to go on the, I think Kenny Moore's on the left or right. Either way, whatever position Kenny Moore is, get him some help on the opposite side. And then staying within the defense, this is basically all defensive stuff. You have to make a decision on Julian Blackmon. They have to decide whether to keep or delete Blackmon, who did very solid this year and stayed mostly healthy. So do they give him a new long-term deal, or do they find something on the open market that makes Julian Blackmon expendable? I'm getting my words mixed up here. So for the Indianapolis Colts, as they wait for another 6 months for to think about and find out the answer of whether Anthony Richardson can be their long-term quarterback, once again, they have to make a lot of moves to assure they can finally turn around the joke that has been themselves and the last 4 seasons of their franchise. Because if Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen don't, I expect their seats to be hot as hell early next fall. So we go from one Southern division to, well, the other Southern division on the NFC side of things, as we now move forward to talk about the Atlanta Falcons. 3 straight 7-10 seasons finally brought change for Atlanta. And, well, regardless of how they went about this change last offseason, they were looking to finally net in 2024 their first playoff berth at minimum in 7 years. So looking back at last offseason for these Atlanta Falcons, they finally made the move to fire Arthur Smith at head coach, and to replace him, they hired former Rams defensive coordinator Raheem Morris in that position. And more importantly, they had to make a decision on what they do at the game's most important position, the quarterback spot. So they went at it in the most interesting way possible, and I don't mean this in a good way. Initially, maybe not, but you never know. But anyway, so looking back at last offseason, they make the decision to sign free agent Kirk Cousins, coming off a torn Achilles though, to a big fat contract. So he goes from Minnesota down to Atlanta. But I wonder if Atlanta knew the risk of signing Kirk Cousins, coming off a mid-season torn Achilles from the previous year. So it seems like they have their quarterback. They have Kirk Cousins. They gave him this big fat contract of, I believe it's 4 years, $180 million. I'm surprised I still remember that number, if that's the correct number. But anyway, they seems like they have their quarterback. But then, interestingly, they make another move that surprised a lot of people the next month. So with the 8th pick in the 2024 NFL draft, they drafted Michael Penix Jr. And that surprised a lot of people. And that especially surprised Kirk Cousins because the front office, they never informed him of that decision. Like, not one single bit at the time. So that threw a lot of people off. That threw a lot of draft analysts off. That threw even the most filthy casuals like me off. And a lot of people questioned it, and rightfully so. Like, why would you draft a quarterback when you just signed one to a big fat deal? It was like the most interesting and questionable decision at the time. But either way, like I said, regardless of how Atlanta handled their offseason, they went into this past season, with a new head coach, 2 new quarterbacks, one of which was coming off an injury, and one who had some potential, but also had a fair share with a major injury. I believe Penix also had a torn ACL. So they were coming in with a kind of a brand new agenda, a brand new regime. And all they simply wanted was get back into the playoffs after having missed it for the last 5 to 6 years. So it seems like they were on track with that. Starting off the season 6-3, they got off to a little bit of a rough start though. Starting off at 1-2, which was a little bit understandable as they tried to adjust to Kirk Cousins, returning from his first ever major injury. But they managed to win 3 straight games against the NFC South, and they went on to win 5-6 overall as Kirk Cousins and the rest of the offense put up much better performances. In this stretch included a season sweep of the Tampa Bay Bucks. And after a victory over the Cowboys in Week 9, it seemed like the Falcons were in complete control at the NFC South. And at the time where we stood halfway through the season, at the time it was kind of like, okay, the Falcons have this in the bag. They have the NFC South in complete control. The Bucks were struggling. The Saints were dealing with so many injuries that they're never going to catch up. I think they were 2-8, 2-7 at the time. And the Carolina Panthers are pretty much rebuilding still. So everyone thought at the time, Atlanta has the division in the bag, especially after having secured the season sweep over Tampa Bay. But oh boy. After Week 9, then it just went down the shitter for Atlanta, because of course it did for Atlanta. All of a sudden, after beating the Cowboys, the Falcons began regressing, and they began regressing fast, especially on offense, as Kirk, he began playing even more scared. He began playing even more like a pocket quarterback. Again, it's a little understandable because he lost some of his mobility. He's an older quarterback coming off his first major injury. But what was even more concerning for the Falcons was that Kirk Cousins was turning the ball over a lot more. And he didn't throw a single touchdown until Week 15. Week 15 against, of all teams, the Raiders. And due to the offense struggling, a defense that had also been struggling all season, they couldn't keep up. And in due time, we were looking at a 4-game losing streak that led to them losing the division lead that they had so firmly, they lost their firmly grasp to the Tampa Bay Bucks. So the Bucks, who inversely, they went on their own winning streak, they caught up. And out of desperation, after a horrid performance from Kirk Cousins, even though they won against the Raiders of all teams, Coach Raheem Morris decided to finally call upon his rookie. Hey, Michael Penix, we need you to start this next game against the New York Giants. So he calls upon Michael Penix Jr., but couldn't you have done that like a game or two earlier? Couldn't you have done that a couple games earlier? Like, I didn't understand the thought process of starting him like 3 games before the season was over. Because when you look at how he played, again, it was against the Giants, but when he played against an actual playoff team, like for example the Commanders, well, that was the only playoff team that Penix played against. But when he played against the Commanders, he had his rookie moments, but he flashed surprisingly, he flashed a lot of potential. He kept the offense moving very well with his dual threat ability, and he managed. Sure, the stats will say, "Oh, he didn't do that well. He didn't flash a lot." But his performance, when you look at the tape, he actually managed to keep the team alive in that game against Washington. He made a very clutch touchdown to Zach. I think it was Zach Ertz or I forgot who it was. Kyle Pitts, I believe it was. Either way, he made a clutch touchdown very late to force overtime. Yeah, they lost that game, but Penix, yeah, he kind of proved me wrong. He kind of proved me wrong. Decision is kind of dumb still, but hey, he proved me wrong. So either way, when you look at the decision to start Michael Penix that late into the season, though, yeah, it's just kind of weird how Raheem Morris really saw Kirk Cousins struggling against the likes of Minnesota, the Chargers, but he really had to wait until the Raider game to bench him for Michael Penix. So when you look at the Falcons season, they started off strong. And while it looked like it was going to be a comeback season for Kirk Cousins, they're finally going to get their first playoff berth in 7-8 years. That once again ended up not being the case because, well, they choked like they always done in typical Falcons fashion. But despite finishing 8-9, they may have found something in soon-to-be second-year quarterback Michael Penix Jr., who flashed in those 3 games to finish the year. He also had a nice performance against Bryce Young and the Carolina Panthers. I know the Panthers were bad too for the most part, but he also had a nice performance to finish off the year. Now, General Manager Terry Fontenot and Coach Raheem Morris, they have to surround their quarterback with better help, especially defensively, if they want to finally get back in the division race and finally claim the NFC South as theirs. So looking at the offseason for them so far, they haven't made a move yet. But when you look at their offseason, they have, well, in the red, they have $5 million in the red, so they got to make a move to get under the cap. As we speak, their first round pick in this upcoming draft is at number 16. Looking at some of their key free agents, probably the biggest one that's on everybody's mind right now, if you're looking for an offensive lineman, is center Drew Dalman, who the Falcons are most likely going to lose because they can't afford him. You're also looking at corners, Antonio Hamilton and Mike Hughes, and edge rusher Matthew Judon, who was a letdown this past season. So for the Falcons, once they get under the cap, once they get in the green, some of the needs that they have to address this offseason, they got to add pieces to the defensive line. Like I said, Judon was sadly a free agent bust. An interior lineman, Eddie Goldman, he's also a pending free agent. So the Falcons, they have to retool their pass rush again to help out their top player in edge rusher Grady Jarrett, because Grady Jarrett needs a lot of help. And then staying within the defense, they also have to add help around great corner at AJ Terrell, because the secondary has been a major issue that for whatever reason Atlanta refuses to fix for whatever reason. Even if they added Jesse Bates in there, it's still a problem. It's still a problem because, well, they haven't addressed yet the other position in that secondary, and that's the cornerback spot. All they have is AJ Terrell, and that's it. They need to add him some help on the opposite side of him. And then on the opposite side of the ball, now that you have your quarterback and Michael Penix Jr., you need to get him another top receiver. Darnell Mooney and Raymond McLeod, they're decent reserve receivers, but Penix needs another top receiver alongside Drake London and Kyle Pitts, assuming the Falcons don't trade him. But nonetheless, Michael Penix Jr. could use another weapon, like a quality weapon, to go alongside Drake London and Pitts. So the Falcons came close, but they once again falconed in 2024. But benching Kirk Cousins may end up being a good call for them as long as Penix builds upon that 3-game stretch, develops along well going into next year. But now it's also on the Dirty Birds in the South to go and fix that defense, get Penix Jr. some much needed help he needs in order to right the wrong from this past year going into the fall real soon. We go from the Dirty Bird's nest in the South to the Red Bird's nest in the desert and talk about the Arizona Cardinals. The return of Kyler Murray from a major injury that he had in 2022 and how he played in the second half of 2023. It gave fans of the Redbirds a little bit of hope going into this past fall of 2024. So looking at what the Redbirds were doing at this point in time last year, well, they didn't really do much in free agency, if you ask me. But the draft was where they made their most notable moves. And what they did was use the 4th overall pick that they got in 2023, and they used it on getting Kyler Murray a little bit of help. They drafted a receiver by the name of Marvin Harrison Jr. From Ohio State. And in the second round of the draft, they got some help on the other side of the ball with an edge rusher, Darius Robinson from the University of Missouri. So other than those 2 big name moves, it was a relatively quiet, but more importantly, drama-free offseason for the Cardinals, as they went into this past season looking to at least improve to where they were in the last 2 years. Because keep in mind, the last 2 years were, 2022 was marred by the injury to Kyler, and 2023 was pretty much, the expected with how things were going to go for the Cardinals, given that Kyler Murray was out for half the year, recovering from that ACL injury, and the team was severely depleted with talent. And going to this year, past year, they were still depleted with talent, but at least you still had Kyler Murray there. You still had some pieces. You added a couple of pieces, but you're still quite a ways away from competing in what probably was going to be a competitive NFC West. So for the Cards, they were still, despite being a little talent deficient, they were still in a fight for the NFC West, and they actually started out, I'd say, pretty decently. They were at the halfway point of the season. They were 6-4, but unfortunately for them, they suffered yet another late season collapse. Now, there are multiple contributors, key contributors to why they suffered another late season collapse, but to generalize why, it was because they were just too inconsistent on both sides of the ball all year. And we'll go into further detail on those inconsistencies, but to go back on my point of, how successful the Cards were this past year, they were the talk of the midseason because they had a 4-game winning streak that included an upset over my 49ers. And I believe they also had they didn't beat the Rams and the Seahawks, but they had another upset win or two. But they were still the talk of the town regardless. They had a 4-game winning streak going on that put them in the midst of a 3-way race with the Rams and the Seahawks in the NFC West. But once they got back from the bye week, everything good that happened to them during that win streak, it completely evaporated in Seattle when they faced the Hawks. And the rest of the way, they suffered a lot of tough losses where they disappeared in the closing moments. So when you look at it, regardless of whoever's coaching that team, and regardless of who's on that roster, they're still vulnerable to the December collapse. Like, they're cursed in December. So going back to my point of the inconsistency with that team, Arizona's roster on both sides, they showed some good. But for the most part, it just couldn't carry over from one game to the next. Notably on the offense. Defensively, they still had their problems from the previous year with the passing defense, like, being a serious issue. Rushing the passer, it didn't really have much in terms of talent, especially Darius Robinson missing a lot of games. But offense, it was the major liability in terms of consistency. The connection between Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr., it didn't connect the way most people expected. Harrison Jr. had a little bit of a tough time adjusting to the NFL. So it was mainly, I'll talk about him later, but Murray and Trey McBride. But everyone else was just there. So that goes to my point of the positives. It wasn't all bad for the Redbirds in the desert. Because when you look at the positives of this past season for Arizona, obviously, that 6-4 start to the season, they were within an arms race within the NFC West. But when you look at it from a team perspective, you look at two players that pretty much kept the team alive for Arizona, and that was James Conner. James Conner was probably a really good running back. No, he was a really good running back. Very hard hitting, very hard to contain against opposing defenses. Having a 1K season again, and even if he was out injured, even if they had to rotate him in and out, his backups like Imari DeMarcado, they filled in nicely for him. And Kyler Murray with his dual threat mobility, he also made up for his absences or whenever Murray had to use his scrambling. So James Conner, he was a rushing minutes once again. And then another player that stood out for Arizona this year was Trey McBride. Outside of a bad helmet deflection, a catch that he was supposed to make in Week 17 against the Rams, that rematch between them, McBride, he himself had a great year as Murray's favorite receiving option. He had some really strong performances, was good after the catch with his physicality and his speed. And while it did take very late in the season to finally score a touchdown, actually 2 to his name, he had a very nice season. McBride should be a major force going forward, especially once Marvin Harrison Jr. and Kyler Murray further establish their chemistry, hopefully this offseason, and especially when we get closer to training camp. So while Arizona had another late season collapse, they didn't make close within a playoff spot. Unfortunately, there's still reason for hope for the Redbirds in the desert, just like last year. Except now it's even more hope within the desert because now you have flashes of improvement on offense. There were a few nice things on defense, but there's still a lot to work on. So they finished the season 8-9, third in the NFC West. So they're taking steps, not big steps, but at least some steps to improve in a competitive division. So general manager Monty Ossenfort and coach Jonathan Gannon, they have a chance to be aggressive and add even more pieces to improve themselves further as free agency dawns upon itself. So looking at their offseason so far, they have around $75 million to spend. They have the 16th overall pick in this upcoming draft. They haven't made any moves yet as we speak right now, but some of the key free agents that they have to consider looking at are linebackers Chris Barnes and Kaiser White. Not sure if they'll keep them around, but you never know. Receiver Greg Dortch, one of their reserve receivers, and then kicker Matt Prater. I'd say he was solid this year. Some of the needs that they have to address during the offseason, they have to upgrade the defensive line on all positions. I say, most of their needs that they have to address is the defense, especially in the trenches, because rookie Darius Robinson, he had a rough year, especially being in and out with injuries. But again, he still has time to develop. He's still relatively young. But in order to do so, the Redbirds, they have to get him some help because currently they don't have anything in the pass rush. That's why they struggled all year defensively again. So speaking of the defense, they have to really improve that secondary. And that starts by getting some help around corner Garrett Williams. They struggled in the passing defense this past season, even with the addition of another pick, former second-round pick, Max Milton. So they need to get more help on the opposite side of Garrett Williams. Otherwise, if they don't, they're going to have a hard time with opposing quarterbacks and opposing receivers. Staying within the trenches on the opposite side of it, they could use a retool on the interior offensive line. Both starting guards, Will Hernandez and Evan Brown, They struggled with injury this past year, and they're on expiring contracts. So general manager Ossenfort, he might as well upgrade them anyways because, well, it's always important to protect Kyler Murray from another serious injury. So Arizona, they showed some improvement this past season. While they didn't make the playoffs and they suffered another late season collapse, they showed some hope. They showed a little bit more optimism for its fan base. Now it's important for the higher ups to keep on building, upon this season, and that starts in free agency. Give Murray some ample protection. Beef up that offensive line. Beef up the defensive line. That should be the top priorities. Well, I'll beef up the defense in general. They do all that, Arizona should be in the thick of the race in the NFC West next year. We flock away from the birds as we now dive into the jungle to talk about the Cincinnati Bengals. Off of the heels of a disappointing and injury-riddled 9-8 2023, the Bengals were hoping to make it back to the playoffs with Joe Burrow. Yeah, and just in general, bounce back from that pretty poor 2023. Yeah, and I say poor even though they finished 9-8 in that year. So looking back at the offseason that was at this point in time last year, Cincinnati saw a lot of changes. Gone was offensive coordinator Brian Callahan to be the Titans' new head coach, and joining him there was corner Chidobe Awuzie and receiver Tyler Boyd. So gone was one of Joe Burrow's top receiving options and a key piece of that defense. Also gone was a key defensive lineman in DJ Reader, who left for the Detroit Lions. But Cincinnati, they tried to counter that by adding safety Geno Stone from the division rival Baltimore Ravens. And they again tried to address the offensive line with the drafting of Georgia's Amarius Mims at right tackle. So for the Cincinnati Bengals, they still had plenty of question marks going into this past year. But the more important thing was they were at least going to have a fully healthy Joe Burrow, who was lost for the second half of 2023 with a serious wrist injury. And going into 2024, like I said, they had high hopes of making it back to the postseason dance, at minimum, at least. Unfortunately, didn't exactly start off in the best way because they lost to the New England Patriots of all teams, and then they went on to start 0-3. And, well, the reason for starting off 0-3 and, well, being at the point that they were, in, was it late November, early December? Well, was because of their god-awful defense. Yeah, they were the primary reason as to why Cincinnati lost as many games as they did all year. Because outside of Mike Hilton, Trey Hendrickson, and Sam Hubbard on that defense, they were one of the worst defenses in the NFL when it came to just about everything. Rushing the quarterback, stopping the run, and especially defending the pass. Like, no matter what size of scale, no matter what kind of play it was, Cincinnati couldn't stop anything. Like, they couldn't, stop a small play, a big play, you know what kind of play. The Bengals defense was so goddamn bad. Like, there was a point in time where they faced the Panthers in a battle of whose defense was more terrible early in the season. It's like, it was just that bad. It was just that damn bad that it cost them so many games. And then you look at it on the other side of the ball, the below average offensive line. Again, for as many times as they try, I don't understand how the Bengals offensive line just can't stay firm. They just can't stay solid enough to protect Joe Burrow. For example, Orlando Brown Jr. had a down year. Amarius Mims, while yes, he's a rookie, he's still struggling. And then Orlando Brown Jr., he missed time with the fractured fibula, and somehow he still played through it when he came back, which was surprising to me. And then let's not forget guard Alex Kappa. He sucked the most out of the entire offensive line. He was one of the worst offensive linemen as a whole in the NFL. He allowed the most pressures, the most sacks on his side of the line, which led to his release after the season, rightfully so. You can't have that. You can't have that in what Cincinnati is trying repeatedly to do in the NFL, and that's protect Joe Burrow one of the most sacked quarterbacks ever since he came into the league. It's like you simply can't have that. So speaking of Joe Burrow, he was one of the highlights of Cincinnati's season. He had an MVP-like year, in my opinion, because, well, the Bengals should be very lucky in general to have Joe Burrow. And not just that, very lucky that he was able to stay fully healthy all season despite all the deficiencies that I just talked about, especially on the offensive line. Very lucky that he was able to play all 17 games after being lost to a wrist injury the year prior. He bounced back in a big way in 2024, having to put pretty much the whole team on his back. And, well, offense too did its part. And for the most part, he succeeded with a lot of very good performances. He finished the year throwing for 40 touchdowns in comparison to the 10 less. I think it was 8 picks that he had. So a very good ratio, in my opinion. I know we don't talk about stats, but just needed to throw that out there. But because, well, he had some very, very good performances. And that rewarded him with the Comeback Player of the Year award, despite the result the Bengals ultimately ended up not getting. And speaking of that, Cincinnati, they sat at 4-8 by the time they lost the first game to the Pittsburgh Steelers after their bye week in December. It was a very tight shootout contest at home, but unfortunately they lost that. But they started a 5-game winning streak that began in Dallas in Jerry World, and it wouldn't have even happened had they not pounced on a miracle blocked punt botch from the Cowboys special teams and from, I forget what player it was, but either way, one of the Cowboys special teams player, he touched the ball, and the Bengals were very quick to get on that, and it gave Joe Burrow and the offense one more lease on life to go and score the game-winning touchdown for that game, and that began a 5-game winning streak that kept their playoff hopes alive for the time being. And they even got a win over the also hunting Denver Broncos and Bo Nix in a very critical game. But they still needed a lot of help to get into the playoffs. And unfortunately for Cincinnati, for all the efforts of that 5-game winning streak, it was pretty much for nothing. Because, well, they didn't get the help they needed, which makes this season for them a wasted one. For all the teams that we talked about already, they were another team that had a wasted season despite all their efforts. So for the Bengals this past year, it was a tale of two halves in 2024. From losing a bunch of close ones that mattered to winning the games that mattered. Even in that second half, though, it just wasn't enough to grab a playoff spot because they needed the one thing. The one thing they needed, and that was a bunch of help. And Denver to lose that final game against the Chiefs B squad. And, well, they didn't get it. They didn't get any help. Now, a lot of people were saying in the lead up to that game against Denver and that B squad Kansas City Chiefs, a lot of people were saying that no one wanted to face Cincinnati if they somehow made it. But are we sure about that? Are we sure about that with that very shitty defense? We sure? But either way, regardless, Cincinnati, they could have made the playoff dance. If they hadn't lost to the Patriots, if they had taken care of business against the Chiefs, if they had taken care of business against the Ravens, against the Chargers, they had they had plenty of chances to win those games, and they didn't. Those losses really came to haunt them. But on a positive note, though, they were fortunate again to have Joe Burrow all season to keep them in it, because had they not, had to go to Jake Browning again, it could have been a lot worse. But if you're looking at from the Bengals side of things, if they really want to make it back to the dance this coming fall, they've really got to make some changes on defense. But so far for Cincinnati, it's not going that way. But first things first, look at the offseason for Cincinnati. They previously had around $62 million in cap space Now, at the time I'm recording this podcast, it's around 43 million now. But yeah, they made a couple moves that either decreased or increased their cap space, their money. But first, let's talk about their first round pick. They're picking at number 17. So if that's a good position for you or a bad position for you, that your mileage may vary. So they made a couple of moves already as we enter the new league year. One of the big moves that they made was tagging receiver T. Higgins for the second straight year. We'll talk a little bit more about that move in just a bit. And the other two big moves that happened on the defense. So they released top edge rusher Sam Hubbard, who immediately announced his retirement afterwards. So a young stud and Sam Hubbard, who spent all of his time in Cincinnati, he announced his retirement at just age 29. And yeah, that's like, congratulations to Sam Hubbard on his retirement. But on the football side of things, that's a big loss for the Bengals defense. And another big loss for the Bengals defense was edge rusher Trey Hendrickson, because he requested a trade. And sadly enough, the Bengals requested it. Like, what are they doing? Requesting this? Like, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it was a mutual thing, and I don't know. Like, what's going on with that defense? Like, what's their philosophy with the defense right now? It's like, I mean, I get the Sam Hubbard thing. I mean, respectfully, but Trey Hendrickson, like, they could have come to a long-term deal with Trey Hendrickson, like an extension. Like, why? It's like, did the long-term deals for Jamar Chase and T. Higgins play a role in this? It's like what? Why is the solution to making your defense better is to make it worse? Is this really the philosophy we're going with this offseason for the Bengals? Is to make next year's defense worse, even worse? It's like, why are we doing it? Why are we doing this for the Bengals? Like, why? What exactly is the thought process for Cincinnati? Like, seriously. So looking at some of the key free agents, aside from Trey Hendrickson, and I don't know, defensive tackle BJ Hill, who I'm not sure if they're going to be keeping. I mean, if they don't keep him, then that's another big loss. And then corner Mike Hilton. And if they don't keep him either, that defense is going to get even worse. So looking at some of the needs that they still have to address this offseason, going back to T. Higgins, they have to decide what to do with them. Do you tag and trade him, or do you find a way to keep him around long term? So, like I said, they tagged T. Higgins, but it's a pretty costly tag at $26 million. And, some of these players, for whatever reason, they don't want to play under the franchise tag. And T. Higgins is one of those players that may not want to play under the franchise tag. So the Bengals, they have to make a decision. Do you do a trade and tag with a team that needs a top receiver, or do you come together and figure out a number with T. Higgins and get a long-term deal done while also trying to fit in an extension for Jamar Chase? You got to figure something out, especially considering what you got to do next. Fix the damn secondary, because this group is so damn bad that it's very difficult to fit them in their own separate team needs. Like, this whole secondary needs fixing. It was one of the worst last year, and maybe even 2 years ago. Like, the last 2 years, this secondary is so damn awful. Corners, safeties, they're like the two positions that Cincinnati really needs to fix in both free agency and the draft. Like, I'm sure they've done this. Like, they've done this in both, but whatever they're picking, it's not working. Like, Geno Stone needs help. They got to re-sign Mike Hilton. Just get some help for someone across Dax Hill at corner. Either way, like, this secondary needs a lot of help. It needs a lot of fixing. And then you got to re-sign BJ Hill. You got to re-sign BJ Hill on the defensive line. And now you have the news of Hubbard's retirement and Hendrickson's trade request being granted. You got to rebuild this defensive line. You got to rebuild this whole ass defensive line. It's like, again, what are the Bengals doing on defense? Like, why? Like why are they doing this? I don't understand this. So, yeah, when you look at the Cincinnati Bengals, like after the season of two halves for them, just to ultimately miss the playoffs with the same record as the year prior at 9-8. Like, it was just a waste of time. It was basically just a waste of time. But they do have more than enough money to fix their litany of issues. But they're going to have to use all that money, all their draft picks, mostly on defense. They got to do it to finally help out their franchise quarterback in Joe Burrow. You got to take so much pressure off of Joe Burrow to finally not just get back to the playoffs, but finally win the damn AFC North and finally get deep again into the playoffs. Because if they don't, continue to expect more of the same next fall in the Cincinnati jungle. For our last team in part 3 of our 2024 NFL season team recap month, we escape the Cincinnati jungle and go into the Emerald City. And I'm not sure if it's wicked, but either way, we now talk about the Seattle Seahawks. This past season marked a new beginning in the Emerald City of Seattle after a decade of Pete Carroll at the helm. And while it was a relatively quiet season in Seattle, the one big key major thing that happened for the Seahawks was that they moved their decade-long head coach Pete Carroll to an advisory role, and replacing him in the head coaching position was former Ravens defensive coordinator Mike Macdonald as the new head coach. So you have a new head coach, you have a new head coaching staff that Mike Macdonald put together, and you pretty much have more of the same roster intact for the Seahawks. Now it's just a matter of, can you actually go and win the NFC West? Now that you had a new head coach, a new coaching staff, and pretty much almost the same roster when it came to the Seahawks in this pretty competitive NFC West. Unfortunately, it wasn't the case. It wasn't the case for the Seahawks, and one of those reasons why was, well, you pretty much saw more regression from Geno Smith in the offense. Now, it's not to say Geno Smith wasn't completely terrible for Seattle, but his performances were kind of mild at best. And what was even more concerning for the Seahawks was that Geno Smith was throwing at least one interception in more than half the games that the Seahawks played this past year. And the inability to target anyone other than DK Metcalf, that was also pretty concerning as well. And even the games that DK Metcalf didn't play due to injury, that was also concerning for the Seahawks offense. But again, not everything on offense was Geno Smith's fault, because there were other glaring errors on this team, like a non-existent running game with Kenneth Walker III. He surprisingly had a down year. The offensive line was a major issue as well, especially in the interior. Some of the play calls from coordinator Ryan Grubb, they were too lenient on the overall reliance of DK Metcalf. Instead, rushing attack, those two issues with the offensive coordinator, it became a detriment to Geno when he had to throw the ball. When those two things weren't working, the over reliance on Metcalf and the rushing attack really failing, so much pressure was put on Geno that, well, it didn't work. And then you had a concerning performances. Like, it was like a mismatch of performances when they played at home in contrast to how they played on the road. Like, Mike McDaniel's squad looked like Mike McDonald. I confused the names, but either way, they looked like they look like completely different teams when they play at home versus on the road. like they still had the issues, sure, on the road, but they when you compare to how they do on the road, they played more prepared in contrast to at home. They went 7-1 away from home versus struggling at 3-6 at home. So it's like they look like a much different team when it comes to home versus road. So otherwise, yeah, that's not going to get it done in general. So looking at the positives for Seattle this past season, it's like a couple things stood out for me. And defensively, while the defense wasn't perfect per se, I look at the cornerback duo of Devin Witherspoon and Rick Woolen. Like they were two pretty good shutdown corners. Devin Witherspoon especially, like he was very difficult to get passed around for opposing receivers. I believe he also had a nice interception at one point. But overall, when you look at that duo, Witherspoon and Rick Woolen, I believe Seattle has a nice duo, a nice shutdown duo in that passing defense. Meanwhile, on the offensive side of things, Jackson Smith-Njigba, did I get the name right this time for all the people out there? But anyway, Jackson Smith-Njigba, the second-year receiver, he came alive for Geno in a year where DK Metcalf had a down year, especially in a couple games where he dealt with I believe it was an ankle injury. And Tyler Lockett, he struggled really, really a lot with getting targets. So Smith-Njigba stepped up greatly as the primary receiver for Geno Smith for a 100-yard catch, 1,000-yard season. And yeah, he did very well for himself this year. And he earned himself his first Pro Bowl appearance in his second year. So he had himself, a breakout season. Especially with the news that will be mentioned soon, he'll more than likely be the new top receiver for Geno Smith going to next fall. So when you look at the Seahawks this past season, while Mike Macdonald provided a new voice for Seattle and some new energy of youth in the Hawks, it was pretty much more of the same for this team. It's pretty much the same offense, same defense, like pretty much some same positives, some same concerns, just with the 1 win improvement and same result. Same result in the end. They just lost the NFC West by just a narrow margin to the LA Rams on a strength of victory tiebreaker. Yeah, that's literally how they lost the division and how they couldn't get a playoff berth either. So yeah, to lose on that, it's kind of sad. But either way, they at least ended the season with a win over the resting Rams, regardless. And now they head into an offseason with year 2 under Mike Macdonald. However you pronounce his name. It's very hard. Again, it's very hard to distinguish McDonald, McDaniel, McDonald's. I want some McDonald's now. But anyway, year 2 under Mike Macdonald, it should be better. But as long as they make the right moves, and some of those moves are going to be pretty difficult to make with free agency looming pretty soon. So looking at their offseasons so far for the Seahawks, they made a couple moves. But let's talk about their money first, because they were in the red initially. They're like $7 million in the red. Now they're around $60 million. And we'll talk about why exactly. They were $16 million in the green. They're 18th in the NFL draft. So I'd say that it's an okay spot to be in. It depends on what they need, what they're going to do with it. Are they going to trade down, trade up? Depends on what they're going to do with it. So they did make some moves prior to the start of free agency. So they released a bunch of players like Draymond Jones at defensive tackle, safety Rayshon Jenkins, George Fant at offensive line, and most notably, they released receiver Tyler Lockett. So all these cost-cutting moves created about $45 million in cap space. So that created a bunch of money for the Seahawks. But probably the most notable thing for the Seahawks was DK Metcalf requesting a trade out of Seattle. And that was pretty surprising, if you ask me. Like Metcalf asking for a trade out of Seattle, probably the biggest news for the Hawks so far. As of right now, they haven't found a trade partner yet, but yeah, to lose two of your top receivers in the offseason so far, yeah, not good. Not good if you're if for the Seahawks. Some of your key free agents include Jaron Reed at defensive tackle and linebacker Ernest Jones. So some of the needs that they have to address for if you're the Seahawks. Well, obviously the top priority is finding a trade partner for DK Metcalf. The sooner the Hawks can fulfill Metcalf's request, the better. As long as they get a good return from it. The longer you keep holding this off, or if you reject it, the more you're going to just infuriate Metcalf. And the more drama you're going to create. And then once you rid yourselves of DK Metcalf, and now that Tyler Lockett is gone, you got to find yourselves two new top receivers, because Jackson Smith-Njigba, he's going to need some help. He's going to need two new running mates to get pressure off of him, keep attention away from him. Perhaps maybe that's where the 18th overall pick could come into play. Isn't that where Jackson Smith-Njigba was picked? Or was it like a couple picks later where he was drafted in 2023? But either way, Jackson Smith-Njigba will need help. He's going to need help either way. And then staying within the offense, they have to retool the interior offensive line, because they dealt with injuries last season. But even then, when they were all healthy, they still struggled to protect Geno and run block. That's why the running game was so bad last year, because of the interior offensive line. They couldn't create rushing lanes. They couldn't create holes for the running backs. So the front office needs to reinvest in the interior offensive line to give Geno some, not just more time inside to find to target somebody, but also help out the running game. And then defensively, you have to re-sign Ernest Jones and Jaron Reed unless you have some replacements in mind. But either way, you got to also retool the pass rush, because all you have in there is Leonard Williams, your All-Pro, your Pro Bowler, Leonard Williams. And the names that I already mentioned are about to hit free agency. So you got to re-sign one or both of them. But even if you do re-sign them, you got to add some depth to that pass rush, because Seattle's D-line has really struggled in the run and QB pressure. So the Seahawks started off this new era of Mike Macdonald with more of the same stuff in 2024. And yeah, pretty much like with all these teams that we talked about, very much wasted time trying to pursue a playoff spot and only to end up not getting it. Given that they released a bunch of players and are about to trade away their top receiver in DK Metcalf, it seems like a lot more change could be coming for the Emerald City this coming season. Now, whether that remains to be seen in terms of whether it's for better or for worse, well, that's to be determined for year 2 of Mike Macdonald's squad. Hello, this is future Very Cold Lasagna here, because there's some news days after I recorded the Seahawks portion of this episode of the podcast that I couldn't necessarily leave out because it would become not only very dated, but also it's too vital to leave out necessarily. And that news was regarding the quarterback for the Seahawks, Geno Smith, who is no longer a Seahawk. He's actually got traded a couple days ago to the Las Vegas Raiders for a 3rd round pick. So yeah, Seattle decided to ship him off to the Sin City, but at least he gets to see a WrestleMania in the next month. But regardless, when it comes to football, yeah, the Seahawks are going to be in need of a quarterback. And that's something I forgot to mention too when it came to their team needs. Like, what exactly are they going to do with Geno Smith? They had to make a decision because he had kind of a big cap hit. He had a big salary going into 2025. I believe it was around $30 million or so. And Seattle didn't have much money going into the offseason. So they had to make a decision on not just Tyler Lockett, but also Geno Smith. And they apparently couldn't come to a renegotiation or restructure. So they decided to ship him away on the last year of his deal to the Raiders. So that's the Raiders' problem, to try to figure out a new contract for Seattle. And, well, Geno Smith is back with Pete Carroll in the Sin City. So apparently, from what I'm hearing right now, that the target for the Seahawks in terms of new quarterbacks currently is Sam Darnold. Whether he's a good fit for them, that remains to be seen. I prefer for Seattle to go and find their new quarterback within the draft. And again, that remains to be seen as well. So it's going to be an interesting search for quarterback for the Seahawks. And it's going to be a brand new offense for Mike McDaniel's squad going to 2025, because no longer do you have Geno Smith at quarterback. They're about to ship away DK Metcalf, and they also don't have Tyler Lockett. So, yeah, it's going to be looking entirely different for that Seahawks offense in the Emerald City. So, yeah, for Seahawks fans out there, yeah, it might get either really interesting or very ugly going into 2025. And that's a wrap on part 3 of our 2024 NFL season team recap month. And in this episode, we talked about 5 teams that had playoff hopes and were close to actually making the playoffs. But unfortunately, they just ended up not making the playoffs at the tail end of the season. And, well, in general, their season was just a waste of time. And those teams were the Indianapolis Colts, the Atlanta Falcons, the Arizona Cardinals, the Cincinnati Bengals, and the Seattle Seahawks. So 5 teams in this episode. And we also talked about a couple of free agency news, and, well, some updates from the last part of our season team recap month. So, yeah, let me know your thoughts on the teams that we talked about in this episode, and what do you think that the teams that we talked about, whether you're a fan of them or not, what they need to do to improve going to the 2025 campaign. So I'd like to know your thoughts, and also if there's any news that I missed on, that I didn't talk about, let me know about that in the comments as well. Whether you're watching this on YouTube, or send me a DM with all the news, all the free agency stuff that's about to come out that I didn't talk about in this episode. Slide into the DMs on Twitter or Instagram, wherever I'm at. My handle is at Very Cold Lasagna. So, yeah, the new league year is about to begin. This is our other Christmas, our Christmas in the off season, when it comes to indulging in NFL content. So, yeah, who knows? Maybe I might do something in relation to all the free agency moves, all the releases, all the trades in week 1 of NFL free agency, the new league year. Who knows? Maybe, but that remains to be seen. But stay tuned. You never know. I might just hop onto this podcast and just talk about all these moves so far that have been made. But until then, that is a wrap on part 3 of our 2024 NFL season team recap month and another episode of the Very Cold Lasagna Podcast. I have been your host, Dylan Lasagna. Thank you for tuning into episode number 256 of this icy yet spicy sports podcast for your filthy casual takes on the world of sports. And until I see ya, when I see you in the next one, peace out.